afternoon sun cast golden shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead, where the annual church bazaar had drawn nearly every resident from their cottages and gardens. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a wooden bench near the tea tent, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue cardigan. To any casual observer, she appeared entirely absorbed in her handiwork, but her sharp eyes missed nothing of the bustling activity around her. The bazaar had been Mrs. Beatrice Tarrant's project, naturally. As the village's self-appointed social coordinator, she had thrown herself into organizing the event with characteristic determination. She moved between the various stalls like a general inspecting troops, her voice carrying across the green as she directed volunteers and adjusted arrangements with military precision. Her late aunt's mahogany sewing box, donated as the grand raffle prize, sat prominently on the prize table like a small shrine to respectability. "Such an exquisite piece," murmured Mrs. Clement, settling beside Miss Marple with a cup of tea. "Though I'm surprised Beatrice decided to part with it. She's always been rather possessive of family heirlooms." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. Perhaps she felt it was time for someone else to appreciate it, she observed mildly, though her gaze had shifted to the antique dealer, Mr. Roland Avery, who was examining the box with professional interest. Avery had arrived in St. Mary Mead only the week before, claiming to be researching local craftsmanship for a book. He possessed the smooth manner of a man accustomed to acquiring valuable objects at favorable prices, and his questions about village families and their possessions had raised more than a few eyebrows. Miss Marple had noticed how his compliments always contained subtle corrections, how his admiration felt calculated rather than genuine. Near the White Elephant stall, young Dulcie Reed arranged donated items with nervous efficiency. The village dressmaker had contributed several lengths of fine silk, though her hands trembled slightly whenever Avery approached her table. Dr. Geoffrey Pierce, recently widowed and still adjusting to life alone, helped with the refreshments while casting occasional worried glances toward Mrs. Vera Blackwood, the postmistress, who seemed unusually agitated today. "The raffle tickets are selling well," announced Sarah Mitchell, Mrs. Tarrant's capable assistant, approaching with the ticket book. At 28, Sarah possessed the quiet competence that made her invaluable to village organizations, though she rarely received recognition for her contributions. Mrs. Tarrant nodded approvingly. "Excellent. We'll draw at 4 o'clock precisely." She touched the small key hanging from a ribbon at her throat, the key to the sewing box, which she guarded like a sacred relic. Miss Marple observed the interplay of personalities with the same attention she gave to her knitting patterns. She noted how Tom Fletcher, the local handyman, kept glancing toward the sewing box with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. She watched Mrs. Blackwood's rigid posture whenever Avery passed her stall, and the way Dulcie's smile faltered under the antique dealer's appraising gaze. "People do become attached to objects," Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Clement, "sometimes more than they realize." The afternoon progressed with the usual mixture of gentle competition and polite conversation. Children ran between the stalls while their parents debated the merits of various preserves and handicrafts. The brass band played cheerful tunes from the bandstand, and the scent of fresh scones drifted from the tea tent. As 4 o'clock approached, Mrs. Tarrant called for attention. The crowd gathered around the prize table, where the sewing box gleamed in the afternoon light. Its mother-of-pearl inlay caught the sun, creating tiny rainbows that danced across its polished surface. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Tarrant began, her voice carrying the authority of long practice, "it's time for our grand raffle draw." She reached into the glass bowl containing the tickets, stirring them with ceremonial gravity. The crowd held its collective breath as she selected a slip of paper and unfolded it with deliberate care. "The winner is ticket number 47, she announced. "That belongs to—" But before she could finish, a sharp cry pierced the afternoon air. It came from the direction of the church vestry, where several ladies had been storing additional prizes and supplies. The sound was followed by Mrs. Pemberton's voice, high and strained with shock. "Oh my goodness, someone come quickly. It's Mrs. Hartwell. She's collapsed." The festive atmosphere shattered instantly. People rushed toward the vestry, abandoning their teacups and conversations. Miss Marple rose from her bench, her knitting falling forgotten to the grass, and followed the crowd with measured steps. Inside the small vestry, Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, the vicar's wife, lay motionless beside an overturned chair. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, but there was no mistaking the stillness that had settled over her. Dr. Pierce knelt beside her, his fingers searching for a pulse he would not find. "I'm afraid she's gone," he said quietly, his professional composure barely masking his distress. "It appears to be her heart." But Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the gathering, noticed something others had missed. Mrs. Hartwell's handbag lay open beside her, its contents scattered across the floor. Among the usual items, handkerchief, spectacles, prayer book, lay a small brass key, identical to the one Mrs. Tarrant wore around her neck. The sewing box, Miss Marple realized, might hold more secrets than anyone had imagined. The crowd pressed closer around Mrs. Hartwell's still form, their voices creating a low murmur of shock and speculation. Dr. Pierce continued his examination with professional thoroughness, though the outcome was already clear to everyone present. Miss Marple remained at the periphery, her keen eyes taking in details that others, in their distress, were overlooking entirely. "Poor Dorothy," whispered Mrs. Clement, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "She seemed perfectly well this morning when I spoke with her after the early service. Not a complaint in the world." "The heart can be so unpredictable at her age," Dr. Pierce said quietly, rising slowly from beside the body. His professional demeanor couldn't quite mask the genuine sorrow in his voice. "She'd mentioned feeling tired lately, though she refused to let me examine her properly. You know how these older ladies can be about such matters." Mrs. Tarrant, still clutching the unannounced raffle ticket in her trembling hand, stepped forward with characteristic authority despite her obvious distress. "We must telephone the police immediately, though it's clearly a natural death. Poor Dorothy was so looking forward to today's bazaar." Her voice carried genuine grief, but Miss Marple noticed how her free hand instinctively moved to touch the key hanging at her throat. "I'll call from the vicarage," offered Sarah Mitchell, ever practical in times of crisis. As she hurried away, Miss Marple bent down with apparent concern and quietly began gathering Mrs. Hartwell's scattered belongings. Her movements were so natural, so grandmotherly, that no one paid attention as she carefully palmed the mysterious brass key, slipping it discreetly into her cardigan pocket alongside her knitting wool. The arrival of Police Constable Williams brought official order to the chaotic scene. Recently transferred from London and eager to prove himself competent, he approached the situation with earnest determination, though his inexperience showed in the way he fumbled with his notebook and seemed uncertain about proper procedure. "Right then," he announced, surveying the vestry with official gravity. "Dr. Pierce, you've completed your examination of the deceased." "Yes, Constable. All indications point to sudden heart failure. Mrs. Hartwell was 73 and had complained of chest pains recently, though she was quite stubborn about medical attention. These things can happen without warning at her age." Williams nodded seriously, scribbling notes. "And who discovered the body?" Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward, her usual composure thoroughly shaken. "I did, Constable. I'd come to fetch additional jam jars from the storage cupboard for my preserve stall. The vestry door was standing ajar, which seemed odd, and I found her exactly as you see her now." "Was anyone else in the vestry during the afternoon?" This question prompted an immediate chorus of responses. Several ladies had been moving in and out throughout the day, storing overflow items and retrieving supplies as needed. Mrs. Hartwell herself had volunteered to organize the extra prizes, a task she'd undertaken alone while others managed their individual stalls. Miss Marple listened to these testimonies with growing fascination. Each account painted a perfectly ordinary picture of village activity, yet she sensed undercurrents of tension that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. She observed how Dulcie Reed kept glancing nervously toward the vestry door, how Mr. Avery had positioned himself strategically where he could observe everyone's reactions, and how Tom Fletcher stood rigidly with his hands thrust deep in his pockets, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Perhaps we should move everyone back to the green," suggested Dr. Pierce diplomatically. "There's nothing more to be accomplished here until the proper authorities arrive from Much Benham." As the crowd began to disperse reluctantly, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Tarrant, who remained frozen beside the prize table, like a sentinel guarding treasure. The mahogany sewing box sat exactly where it had been placed that morning, its polished surface reflecting the vestry's dim electric lighting. "Such a terrible shock for everyone," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying just the right note of elderly sympathy. Mrs. Hartwell was such a devoted member of our community, always willing to help with church activities. Yes, she certainly was. Mrs. Tarrant's voice carried a strained quality. She absolutely insisted on helping with the prize storage today. Said she wanted everything to be absolutely perfect for the bazaar's success. Her fingers worried unconsciously at the key hanging from her throat. I should have realized she was overtaxing herself with all the lifting and organizing. "The raffle drawing," Miss Marple observed quietly, nodding toward the slip of paper still clutched in Mrs. Tarrant's hand. "You were just about to announce the winner when this tragedy occurred." "Ticket number 47. Mrs. Tarrant looked down at the crumpled paper as if seeing it for the first time. "I suppose we'll have to postpone everything now, won't we? It wouldn't be appropriate to continue under these circumstances." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she couldn't help noticing how genuinely relieved Mrs. Tarrant seemed at this necessary postponement. "That would certainly be the respectful course, though I find myself curious about your aunt's beautiful sewing box. You mentioned earlier that it's been in your family for several generations." "Oh yes, it belonged to Aunt Millicent originally. She was quite particular about it and has always claimed it contained the family's most precious treasures." Mrs. Tarrant's laugh carried a slightly forced quality, though I suspect she was being rather dramatic in her old age. "It's mostly filled with old sewing patterns and vintage buttons, that sort of thing." As they spoke, Miss Marple observed the other villagers beginning to pack up their stalls with subdued efficiency. The afternoon's festive atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by the hushed tones and careful movements that invariably followed unexpected death. Yet beneath this surface propriety, she detected something else entirely, an undercurrent of unease that seemed strangely disproportionate to a simple case of heart failure. Mr. Avery approached them with appropriately solemn expression. "Mrs. Tarrant, please accept my sincere condolences. I didn't know Mrs. Hartwell personally, but she seemed a thoroughly lovely lady from our brief acquaintance. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Avery. She truly was wonderful. I do hope this tragedy won't prevent the raffle from eventually taking place. That sewing box really is quite a remarkable piece of craftsmanship. The inlay work suggests it might be worth considerably more than most people would realize." Mrs. Tarrant's grip visibly tightened around her protective key. "I'm sure we'll reschedule when the time seems appropriate." Miss Marple watched this exchange with particular interest, noting how Avery's eyes lingered hungrily on the sewing box and how Mrs. Tarrant's knuckles whitened defensively around her small talisman. When the antique dealer finally moved away, she turned to Mrs. Tarrant with an expression of innocent curiosity. "Such a knowledgeable gentleman, that Mr. Avery. Has he shown considerable interest in our local antiques since his arrival?" "Rather too much interest, if you ask my honest opinion," Mrs. Tarrant replied sharply, then seemed to catch herself speaking too freely. "I mean, naturally he's interested in his professional field, but some family treasures are better left in the proper hands, don't you agree?" Before Miss Marple could respond thoughtfully, Sarah Mitchell returned from the vicarage, her face noticeably pale. "Inspector Slack is driving over from Much Benham immediately. He should arrive within the hour." She paused, glancing around the vestry with obvious concern. "Mrs. Tarrant, perhaps we should secure all the valuable prizes. With all this confusion and people coming and going." "Yes, absolutely." Mrs. Tarrant moved toward the sewing box with fierce determination. "I'll take this home for proper safekeeping. The other items can remain safely in the church hall overnight." As she carefully lifted the antique box, Miss Marple noticed something that made her pause thoughtfully. The brass lock showed tiny fresh scratches around the keyhole that definitely hadn't been there that morning when she'd admired the piece. Someone had recently attempted to open the box, and quite recently indeed. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as the villagers finally dispersed, leaving behind the scattered remnants of what should have been a delightful community celebration. Miss Marple walked slowly homeward, her mind methodically turning over the day's events, like pieces of an increasingly complex puzzle. The brass key in her cardigan pocket seemed to grow heavier with each measured step, and she found herself wondering exactly what secrets Mrs. Hartwell might have discovered in those final, fatal moments of her life. Evening had settled gently over St. Mary Mead by the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, the brass key from Mrs. Hartwell's scattered belongings weighing heavily in her cardigan pocket. She prepared her customary cup of tea with deliberate care, then drew the mysterious key from her pocket and placed it beside her saucer. In the lamplight, it appeared entirely ordinary, a simple brass key with a rounded bow, yet identical to the one Mrs. Tarrant wore so protectively around her throat. A gentle knock interrupted her contemplation. Sarah Mitchell stood at the door, her usual composure strained to transparency like delicate china held to light. "Inspector Slack has arrived from Much Benham," she announced without preamble. "He's questioning everyone who entered the vestry today. I thought you should know." Miss Marple invited her in for tea, noting how the young woman's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup. "He seemed particularly interested in the prizes," Sarah continued, "especially Mrs. Tarrant's sewing box. She's taken it home for safekeeping, which didn't please him at all." "And Mrs. Hartwell?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Sarah's expression grew troubled. 2 days ago, she received a registered letter. Mrs. Blackwood insisted on delivering it personally because Dorothy had mentioned expecting something important. After that, she seemed quite preoccupied. Yesterday, she came asking for the spare vestry cupboard key, the little brass one for the lower cabinet. This detail sparked particular interest in Miss Marple's keen mind. "A registered letter, you say?" "From London solicitors, according to Mrs. Blackwood. Calthorpe and Mellish, I believe." Dorothy signed for it with a very steady hand, but afterward she kept saying she needed to put something right before the bazaar. After Sarah departed, Miss Marple found herself visited by Dr. Pierce, whose medical concerns added another layer to the afternoon's puzzle. "Something troubles me about Dorothy's positioning," he confided, settling heavily into her guest chair. "When someone suffers sudden heart failure, they typically collapse wherever they happen to be standing. But Dorothy was found beside that overturned chair, as if she'd been seated. Yet there was no reason for her to be sitting while organizing prizes." Through her window, Miss Marple observed the arrival of Inspector Slack's motor car, followed by various villagers making their way to the church for questioning. Each carried themselves differently now, the easy camaraderie of the morning replaced by careful, measured movements of people suddenly conscious of being observed. Tom Fletcher appeared particularly noteworthy as he emerged from Mrs. Tarrant's side gate, tools in hand and cap respectfully removed upon seeing her. "Evening, Miss Marple. Just fixing Mrs. Tarrant's back door latch. She was fretting about security with that valuable box in the house." Miss Marple's observant eyes caught the faint smear of brass dust at his cuff, the kind that sinks into cloth and resists casual brushing. "You're always so handy with locks, Tom." "Only simple repairs," he replied quickly. "Don't do keys, mind. That's Whitcomb in Much Benham for proper locksmith work." Later, when Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Tarrant to offer condolences, she found the woman in that brittle state of hospitality which recognizes tea as an antidote to everything. The mahogany sewing box sat prominently on the central table, and in the lamplight, the fresh scratches around its keyhole were unmistakably clear. Inspector Slack made me sign papers and put a seal over the keyhole, Mrs. Tarrant explained with genuine indignation, riding curiously on deeper, quieter relief, as if I would open it inappropriately in my own house. Did Mrs. Hartwell ever express particular interest in the box? Miss Marple inquired innocently. Mrs. Tarrant hesitated. She asked me 3 days ago if I was quite certain about using it for the raffle. Said some objects have strings tied to them, metaphorical strings, and one ought to be sure before pulling them. I told her nonsense. It's mine to dispose of as I see fit. The following morning brought Inspector Slack's official pronouncement of natural causes, though the village buzzed with persistent speculation. Miss Marple's visit to Mrs. Blackwood's shop yielded particularly illuminating information. Poor Mrs. Hartwell was quite wrapped up in that raffle, Mrs. Blackwood confided. She was so hoping to win the sewing box, said it reminded her of her own mother's. Every time she came in these past weeks, she mentioned it. Even tried to persuade Mrs. Tarrant to let her peek inside just for old time's sake. But Mrs. Tarrant was quite firm, said it was for the raffle, and no peeking allowed. Walking home through the familiar lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence. Mrs. Hartwell's registered letter from London solicitors, her determination to put something right, her specific interest in the sewing box, the mysterious duplicate key, and the fresh scratches around the lock, all suggested a narrative far more complex than simple heart failure during a church bazaar. The brass key in her pocket seemed to pulse with significance, a small piece of metal that might unlock far more than a simple sewing box. In her experience, the most dangerous secrets were often those hidden in plain sight, disguised as perfectly innocent family heirlooms. Tomorrow, she decided, would require some very careful investigation indeed. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in her methodical mind, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. Like a beautifully embroidered tapestry, the village presented a lovely surface while concealing many tangled, hidden threads beneath, threads that could prove quite deadly when pulled. Morning broke with unusual clarity over St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself sought to illuminate the shadows cast by yesterday's tragedy. Miss Marple rose earlier than her custom demanded, the brass key from Mrs. Hartwell's scattered belongings weighing heavily in her thoughts. She dressed with deliberate care and made her way toward the post office, where Mrs. Blackwood's punctual efficiency could always be relied upon for useful information. Such a terrible shock about Mrs. Hartwell, Mrs. Blackwood observed, her voice carrying the hushed tones reserved for discussing the recently departed. Though I must say, she seemed quite preoccupied these past few days. That registered letter from Calthorpe and Mellish in London had her quite stirred up. She asked about the earliest post collection yesterday morning, most unusual for Dorothy, who was never one to rush correspondence. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Registered letters do tend to contain matters of importance. Indeed. And speaking of correspondence, Mr. Avery sent a rather sharp telegram to London last evening. Hardly the tone one expects for condolence messages, if you take my meaning. Armed with this intelligence, Miss Marple proceeded to the church, where Constable Williams stood guard with earnest determination. She obtained his permission to arrange fresh flowers in the vestry, a perfectly natural request that allowed her to examine the scene more thoroughly. The small room held secrets beyond yesterday's tragedy. On the parish blotter, Miss Marple discovered faint impressions pressed into the pink felt, ghostly letter edges that revealed themselves when viewed at the proper angle. One word emerged more clearly than the others. Millicent, Mrs. Tarrant's aunt, whose sewing box had become the center of so much attention. Something pale caught her eye near the skirting board, a torn fragment of buff envelope bearing the embossed letterhead, Calthorpe and Mell, where it had been ripped. She carefully retrieved it with her handkerchief and presented it to Constable Williams, who gratefully added it to his growing list of evidence. Her methodical investigation was interrupted by footsteps. Tom Fletcher appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with obvious discomfort. "Miss Marple, there's something I ought to tell you about Mrs. Hartwell. 2 weeks ago, she asked me to make her a duplicate key. Showed me a brass key and claimed it was for her own storage box, but..." He paused, clearly troubled. "But you had doubts?" "The key was too new, too clean. Not the sort that's been used regularly for years, and Mrs. Hartwell wasn't one for deception usually, but she seemed nervous about the whole business. Kept looking over her shoulder like she was afraid of being seen." This confession confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the duplicate key's purpose. Tom's hands, she noted, bore traces of brass polish beneath his fingernails, evidence of more recent metalwork than he'd initially admitted. Later, while calling upon Mrs. Tarrant to discuss the postponed raffle arrangements, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Avery departing with the studied casualness of a man attempting to appear nonchalant. His eyes gleamed with barely concealed frustration as he tipped his hat. "Such a shame about the investigation disrupting your research," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Indeed. That sewing box represents exceptional craftsmanship, possibly worth considerably more than Mrs. Tarrant realizes. The mother-of-pearl inlay suggests 18th century work. I'd hoped to examine it more closely for scholarly purposes." His tone suggested interests extending far beyond academic research, particularly when combined with his urgent telegram to London. Inside Mrs. Tarrant's parlor, the mahogany sewing box sat under Inspector Slack's official seal, the fresh scratches around its keyhole clearly visible in the afternoon light. Mrs. Tarrant hovered nearby with protective anxiety. "Aunt Millicent was always rather dramatic about that box," she explained. "Claimed it held family secrets, though I assumed that was merely her theatrical nature. She was quite private about its contents." Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Dulcie Reed's shop proved equally illuminating. The young dressmaker seemed smaller within her domain of fabrics and patterns, her usual nervous energy amplified to obvious distress. "Mrs. Hartwell came to see me 3 days ago," Dulcie confessed, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "She asked the strangest questions about my grandmother's sewing patterns, particularly those with distinctive rose motifs. She wanted to know if I still had the original designs." "And did you?" "Some, yes. Grandmother left me several pattern books. Mrs. Hartwell seemed particularly interested in one specific design, a christening gown pattern with intricate lacework. In the margin, there was a small notation in pencil, MT 1923. She became quite excited when I showed her, asked to borrow the pattern book, said she needed to verify something important." The pieces were arranging themselves with increasing clarity in Miss Marple's methodical mind. Mrs. Hartwell had received legal correspondence that prompted her investigation into the sewing box's true ownership. The pattern books suggested disputed provenance dating back to 1923, when someone with the initials MT, presumably Millicent Tarrant, had marked designs that might not have been rightfully hers. The duplicate key represented Mrs. Hartwell's attempt to access the box's contents and verify her suspicions. Someone had discovered her investigation and silenced her before she could expose whatever family secrets lay hidden within that seemingly innocent sewing box. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked slowly homeward, her mind busy with calculations and deductions. The killer, undoubtedly, believed their secret was safe with Mrs. Hartwell's death, but they had underestimated both the persistence of village curiosity and the methodical mind of an elderly lady who understood that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden in the most innocent places. Tomorrow would require some very careful maneuvering indeed. The brass key in her pocket seemed to pulse with significance, a small piece of metal that might unlock not just a sewing box, but a decades-old deception that someone had already killed to protect. The morning brought a soft drizzle that seemed to wash the village clean of yesterday's tensions, though Miss Marple knew that beneath St. Mary Mead's restored tranquility, the undercurrents of suspicion continued to flow. She had spent the early hours in quiet contemplation, the brass key from Mrs. Hartwell's scattered belongings resting beside her breakfast cup like a small, silent accusation. Her first call was upon Sarah Mitchell at the vicarage, where the young woman was attempting to restore order to Mrs. Hartwell's personal effects. The vicar, summoned to a parishioner's bedside in Much Benham, had left Sarah to manage the delicate task of sorting through a lifetime's careful accumulations. "I found something rather curious," Sarah confided, leading Miss Marple to Mrs. Hartwell's small writing desk. "Her household notebook has a page torn out. Quite deliberately, I'd say. You can still see the impression of her writing on the page beneath." Miss Marple examined the notebook with careful attention. By holding it to the window light at precisely the right angle, she could make out the ghostly imprint of Mrs. Hartwell's careful penmanship. "Not ours to give," followed by what appeared to be a date, July 1923. "Such a curious phrase," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Mrs. Hartwell was always so particular about proper ownership of things." Sarah nodded earnestly. She had very firm principles about borrowing and lending. Once, when the Flower Guild accidentally used the wrong vases for a wedding, she insisted we return them immediately and apologize personally to the rightful owner. This small insight into Mrs. Hartwell's character painted a picture of a woman who would indeed be troubled by the discovery that a treasured family heirloom might have been obtained through less than honorable means. The torn page suggested she had been preparing some kind of record or statement, evidence, perhaps, of what she had uncovered about the sewing box's true provenance. Miss Marple's next visit was to the church, where she found Tom Fletcher making repairs to the vestry door frame under Constable Williams's watchful supervision. The handyman's usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by a grim concentration that spoke of a man carrying burdens beyond simple carpentry. "Terrible thing about Mrs. Hartwell," she remarked conversationally as she arranged fresh flowers on the altar. "She seemed quite preoccupied these past few days." Tom's hammer paused mid-swing. "Aye, she was that. Came to me last week asking odd questions about old locks and keys. Wanted to know if I'd ever worked on anything from the Whitmore estate, that big house that was sold off years ago." This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. "The Whitmore estate? I'd quite forgotten that connection." "Mrs. Hartwell was a Whitmore before she married," Tom continued, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "Her family lost everything in the troubles of the early 20s. She mentioned once that her grandmother's sewing things had been scattered to the winds when the estate was broken up." The pieces were beginning to form a clearer pattern in Miss Marple's methodical mind. If Mrs. Hartwell had been investigating the sewing box's connection to her own family's lost possessions, her determination to put something right took on a much more personal significance. Her afternoon visit to Dulcie Reed's shop provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. The young dressmaker seemed particularly nervous today, her hands trembling as she showed Miss Marple various fabric samples. "I've been thinking about that pattern book Mrs. Hartwell borrowed," Dulcie said hesitantly. "The one with my grandmother's designs. I remembered something after she left. Grandmother always said some of her finest work was done for the lady from the big house. She never mentioned a name, but she kept one pattern separate from the others, wrapped in tissue paper. Said it was too fine for ordinary folk." "And this special pattern?" "A christening gown with the most intricate lacework you've ever seen. In the margin, there was a note in grandmother's hand. For the Ladies' Special Commission, July 1923. I showed it to Mrs. Hartwell, and she became quite excited. Asked if she could take it away to compare with something." The timeline was becoming clearer. In July 1923, someone, presumably Millicent Tarrant, had commissioned Agnes Reed to create an elaborate christening gown. But the circumstances surrounding this commission appeared to involve more than simple needlework. Miss Marple's evening was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Dr. Pierce arrived, looking deeply troubled, carrying a small leather journal under his arm. "I've been going through my father's old medical records," he explained without preamble, "looking for any mention of the Whitmore family or events from 1923. I found something rather disturbing." He opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. "My father attended a young woman in July 1923, unmarried, from a respectable family, requiring discretion." The entry is deliberately vague, but he notes that arrangements were made for the child's future care and that certain items of value were provided as security for ongoing expenses. Items of value? He mentions specifically a mahogany sewing box with mother-of-pearl inlay among the items transferred. The young woman's initials are given, as MT. The implications were staggering. Millicent Tarrant had apparently given birth to an illegitimate child in 1923 and had used valuable items, possibly stolen from the Whitmore estate, to secure the child's care and her own reputation. The sewing box that Mrs. Tarrant now treasured as a family heirloom was actually evidence of a decades-old scandal. As Dr. Pierce departed, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, the brass key gleaming in the lamplight. Mrs. Hartwell had discovered the truth about the sewing box and had been preparing to expose the deception. Someone had murdered her to protect a secret that reached back 30 years, a secret that involved not just theft, but illegitimate birth, hidden identity, and carefully constructed lies. The killer had counted on the death appearing natural, but they had underestimated the persistence of an elderly lady who understood that the most innocent-looking family treasures often concealed the darkest secrets. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, would require some very careful maneuvering indeed. The brass key in her possession might unlock more than a simple sewing box. It might unlock a killer's carefully guarded past. Outside her window, a shadow moved briefly across Mrs. Tarrant's garden, pausing near the back gate before melting away into the darkness. Someone else was growing desperate as the investigation continued, and desperate people, Miss Marple knew from long experience, were capable of making very dangerous mistakes. The shadow Miss Marple had glimpsed moving through Mrs. Tarrant's garden proved to be more than mere imagination when she discovered fresh impressions in the soft earth beneath her cottage window the following morning. The overnight drizzle had created perfect conditions for recording nocturnal visitors, and the narrow boot prints with their distinctive nicked heel told a story of someone who had stood listening beneath her window for some considerable time. Miss Marple examined the evidence with the methodical attention she might give to a complex knitting pattern. The prints approached from the lane, paused beneath her window, then continued toward Mrs. Tarrant's back garden before returning by the same route. Someone had been conducting surveillance, gauging perhaps how much the village's most observant resident had deduced about the previous day's revelations. Her morning visit to the post office provided additional pieces to the increasingly complex puzzle. Mrs. Blackwood, arranging the morning mail with her characteristic precision, seemed particularly animated by the unusual volume of official correspondence. Inspector Slack received another lengthy telegram from those London solicitors. She confided, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for information too significant to withhold entirely. Calthorpe and Mellish seemed quite insistent about some matter involving Mrs. Hartwell's inquiries, and Mrs. Tarrant has been expecting a registered delivery since yesterday evening, though it hasn't arrived as scheduled. This intelligence proved immediately relevant when Mrs. Tarrant herself appeared at the post office door, her usually immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of strain. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her gloves, and her composed demeanor had acquired a brittle quality that suggested someone fighting to maintain control over rapidly deteriorating circumstances. "Any word about my expected delivery?" she inquired, her voice carrying an urgency that hadn't been present in their previous encounters. Mrs. Blackwood consulted her ledger with professional thoroughness. "Nothing yet, I'm afraid. The morning post from London sometimes experiences delays." Miss Marple observed Mrs. Tarrant's poorly concealed disappointment and noted how her gaze kept drifting toward the door as if she expected unwelcome visitors at any moment. After Mrs. Tarrant departed with obvious reluctance, Miss Marple lingered to examine the morning newspapers, where a small advertisement caught her attention. Information sought regarding Whitmore estate dispersal, 1923. Confidential inquiries welcomed. The timing seemed far too coincidental to be mere chance. Someone was actively investigating the same historical connections that had cost Mrs. Hartwell her life. Her contemplation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's arrival, accompanied by Constable Williams and wearing the expression of a man who had discovered complications in what should have been a straightforward case. "Miss Marple, I'm glad to find you here. We've had developments overnight that require your particular insights." He explained that Mrs. Tarrant had reported signs of attempted entry at her cottage, scratches around the back door lock and disturbed earth near the scullery window. More significantly, the official seal on the mahogany sewing box appeared to have been tampered with, though Mrs. Tarrant insisted nothing had been touched. "The curious thing," Slack continued, "is that when we weighed the box this morning, it registered several ounces lighter than Mrs. Tarrant's documentation indicated it should, even when empty. Something was removed, though the seal appeared intact." Miss Marple accompanied them to Mrs. Tarrant's cottage, where the evidence of nocturnal intrusion was clearly visible. The boot prints matched those she had discovered beneath her own window, and fresh scratches around the door lock suggested someone with considerable skill in such matters. Inside, the sewing box sat on its table exactly as before, but Miss Marple's experienced eye detected faint tracks in the dust where something long and narrow had rested beside it, then been removed. "A thin metal instrument," she observed quietly. "Something that could slide beneath a seal without breaking it, a ruler perhaps, or a similar tool." Their investigation was interrupted by urgent news from the village centre. Dulcie Reed's shop had been entered, overnight, though not violently. Drawers stood open and haberdashery lay scattered, but only one item was missing: the pattern book containing her grandmother's designs, which Mrs. Hartwell had borrowed and Dulcie had recently retrieved at Inspector Slack's request. At the shop, Miss Marple discovered a small fragment of tissue paper beneath the counter, marked with pale blue chalk dust of the type tailors use for tracing patterns. Dulcie, white-faced with distress, recalled a customer the previous evening asking for embroidery thread in an unusual shade. His voice was pleasant but hurried, she explained. "I couldn't be certain, but I thought it might have been Mr. Avery. He seemed particularly interested in the framed photograph of my grandmother above the sewing machine." The afternoon brought Mr. Avery himself, whose usually smooth demeanor showed distinct signs of strain. He approached Miss Marple with forced casualness, but his eyes carried the calculating look of a man rapidly reassessing his position. "Miss Marple, I understand you may have encountered a small brass key among Mrs. Hartwell's effects," he said without preamble. "It's connected to some valuable antique locks I'm researching. Given the circumstances, I thought it prudent to ensure proper documentation." His emphasis on proper documentation carried unmistakable warning, and Miss Marple noted how his gaze swept her cottage as if searching for something specific. She deflected his inquiries with gentle firmness, observing how his composure slipped when she mentioned that such matters were now in Inspector Slack's capable hands. After Avery's abrupt departure, Miss Marple reflected on the day's accumulating evidence. The nighttime intrusions, the tampered sewing box, the stolen pattern book, and Avery's desperate interest in the brass key all suggested someone growing increasingly frantic to retrieve or destroy evidence of their carefully hidden past. Her evening visit to Sarah Mitchell at the vicarage provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Among Mrs. Hartwell's effects, Sarah had discovered a collection of family photographs from the Whitmore estate, including one from 1922 showing a group of young women at a garden party. Millicent Tarrant was clearly identifiable, but more significantly, the photograph also showed another young woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to someone Miss Marple recognized from current village life. Mrs. Hartwell had written a note on the back, Sarah explained, her voice subdued. She'd penciled MT's daughter with a question mark. She'd been making inquiries about birth records from July 1923, and she'd contacted the Foundling Hospital in London. The implications were staggering. Mrs. Hartwell had been building a comprehensive case to prove that Millicent Tarrant's illegitimate child was not only alive, but living among them, possibly unaware of their true parentage. Someone had murdered her to prevent this revelation from destroying a carefully constructed identity that had been maintained for 30 years. As darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked slowly homeward, her mind busy with the day's discoveries. The brass key in Inspector Slack's possession was more than evidence. It was the symbol of secrets that someone had already killed to protect. The killer undoubtedly believed their secret was safe with Mrs. Hartwell's death, but they had underestimated both the persistence of village curiosity and the methodical mind of an elderly lady who understood that family treasures often concealed the darkest truths. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, would require some very careful maneuvering indeed. The desperate attempts to retrieve evidence suggested that someone was losing control of their carefully maintained deception, and desperate people, in her long experience, were capable of making very dangerous mistakes. The morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage with the determined air of a man who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with evidence that refused to arrange itself into neat, official categories. He carried with him a manila envelope bearing the impressive letterhead of Calthorpe and Mellish, delivered by special messenger at dawn. "The London solicitors have made their position quite clear," he announced, settling into a parlour chair with the envelope in hand. "They've written directly to Mrs. Tarrant, advising against any disposal of the sewing box on legal grounds. More significantly, they reference a document that Mrs. Hartwell was meant to retrieve from the box itself, something proving original provenance that would settle the matter quietly." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. "And this document?" "That's precisely what we intend to discover. I've taken custody of the brass key you so wisely suggested I secure, and Mrs. Tarrant has agreed to open the box under official supervision this morning." They proceeded to Mrs. Tarrant's cottage, where Sarah Mitchell waited as an impartial witness, her usual composed efficiency masking what Miss Marple recognized as carefully controlled anxiety. Dr. Pierce stood by the mantelpiece with the forced ease of a man attempting to appear casual about matters of grave importance. Mrs. Tarrant herself appeared pale but determined, the extreme composure of someone clinging to familiar routines in the face of crisis. The mahogany sewing box sat on the central table, Inspector Slack's official seal still intact across its keyhole. "Shall we proceed?" Slack inquired, breaking the seal with ceremonial care. Mrs. Tarrant unlocked the lid with her chain key, and the hinges lifted to reveal the familiar contents. Bone bobbins, delicate ivory windows, spools of silk thread, and a bundle of tattered lace. The interior carried the comforting scent of lavender and old fabric, yet Miss Marple's experienced eye detected something amiss in the arrangement. "How beautifully preserved everything is," she murmured, and Sarah, responding to the subtle cue in her tone, bent closer to examine the contents. Inspector Slack, alerted by Miss Marple's observation, carefully removed the upper trays. What emerged was immediately apparent to anyone who had ever dealt with concealed compartments. A faint ridge beneath the velvet lining where the fabric fell slightly against a hairline seam. "A false bottom," he announced, working his fingernail beneath the lip. The hidden panel lifted to reveal a cavity that should have contained the documents referenced in the solicitor's letter. The space was entirely empty. Mrs. Tarrant's reaction was a complex mixture of relief and indignation that didn't quite ring true to Miss Marple's experienced ear. "What is the meaning of this? If there were documents, they certainly weren't placed there by me." Dr. Pierce exhaled slowly, as though an answer had been both expected and dreaded. Sarah's hand tightened against the back of a chair, her knuckles showing white through her gloves. Miss Marple observed the smallest tremor pass along the young woman's sleeve and thought of the careful notation on Mrs. Hartwell's photograph. M.T.'s daughter. Inspector Slack examined the empty cavity with professional thoroughness. A few pale crumbs of parchment clung to a splinter along the edge, and caught in the velvet nap was a dusting of soft blue, the distinctive shade of tailor's chalk. "That appears to be the same chalk dust we found at Miss Reed's shop," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Such a specific color. Dulcie mentioned it was her grandmother's preferred shade for tracing delicate patterns." Sarah spoke quickly, perhaps too quickly. "But Dulcie's shop was burgled. The pattern book was stolen. Surely that suggests someone is trying to implicate her." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, warmth in her tone but not in her eyes. "Though people do sometimes arrange things to look as if someone else arranged them." Their investigation was interrupted by an apologetic knock. Mr. Avery stood in the doorway, hat in hand and contrition carefully arranged across his features. "Forgive the intrusion, Inspector. I was passing and thought, given the unfortunate break-in at Miss Reed's establishment, I might offer my expertise regarding antique fittings and security measures." Inspector Slack regarded him with the heavy patience that polite society often mistook for dullness. "We have all the expertise we require, thank you. Good day, Mr. Avery." The antique dealer withdrew with practiced grace, but Miss Marple watched the space he had occupied as if the air itself might retain fingerprints. His timing, she reflected, was remarkably convenient for someone who had merely been passing. When the room had settled again, Slack handed Mrs. Tarrant the solicitor's envelope. She broke the seal with trembling fingers, her eyes moving first to the signature, then to the dense paragraphs of legal terminology, and finally to a small blue enclosure. "They assert that the box was pledged in 1923 as security for a child's maintenance," she read aloud, her voice carefully level. "Any transfer of ownership must be approved by their trustees. They reference a certificate of provenance that was to be concealed within the box's hidden compartment. As it is not present, they advise immediate contact and warn of grave reputational consequences should the item be publicly disposed of." "Which is a solicitor's method of shouting very quietly indeed," Slack observed dryly. On the walk back toward the village center, Miss Marple fell into step with Sarah Mitchell. "It is a curious thing," she remarked conversationally, "how a christening gown can outlast the child for whom it was intended, and yet sometimes not the secret it was meant to commemorate." Sarah glanced at her quickly, an instinctive movement that spoke of recognition, then looked away. "I was only thinking of poor Dulcie. This chalk dust, they'll suspect her of the theft." "It is not the chalk that concerns me, dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "It is the haste with which someone is attempting to eliminate evidence. Desperate people make careless mistakes, and careless mistakes, in my experience, often prove illuminating." By afternoon, that desperation had indeed manifested itself in increasingly reckless actions. Word came that the stolen pattern book had been returned to Dulcie's shop through the letter slot, bound with string and missing only the tissue paper containing the christening gown, tracing marked July 1923. Inside the wrapping was a note in block letters. "All mistakes are fixed. Forget the rest." Inspector Slack examined the note with professional interest. "Either genuinely amateurish," he muttered, "or very cleverly designed to appear so." Miss Marple stood close enough to detect the faintest whiff of coal tar soap, the institutional variety supplied in bulk to the post office for parcel wrapping. "Such soap does tend to cling to one's hands," she observed, "particularly if one doesn't rinse thoroughly." The pattern was becoming clear to her methodical mind. Someone was systematically removing evidence while attempting to cast suspicion elsewhere. The empty sewing box, the returned pattern book with its crucial missing piece, the careful arrangement of false clues, all suggested a killer who understood the importance of misdirection but was growing increasingly desperate as the investigation continued. As evening approached, Tom Fletcher appeared at her garden gate with obvious reluctance. "Miss Marple, I found something you ought to see. A thin steel ruler in the hedge behind Mrs. Tarrant's scullery. Could have been tossed there from the lane. Fresh scrape along one edge." She examined the implement carefully, noting the ghost of blue chalk dust caught in the groove along its edge. "Thank you, Tom. Observation without curiosity can indeed be a great virtue." The ruler was clearly the instrument used to extract the hidden documents from the sewing box without breaking the official seal, a technique requiring both patience and considerable skill. Someone had planned Mrs. Hartwell's murder with meticulous care, then spent the subsequent days methodically eliminating every piece of evidence that might expose their crime. But in their very desperation to appear innocent, Miss Marple reflected, they were revealing more about themselves than they realized. Tomorrow would require some very careful maneuvering indeed, for she was beginning to understand not just what had happened, but who had made it happen, and why. The brass key that had started this investigation was only the beginning. The real key to the mystery lay in understanding which of her neighbors possessed both the medical knowledge to commit undetectable murder and the cold calculation to destroy an innocent woman's life in order to protect a 30-year-old secret. The killer was growing desperate, and desperate people, in Miss Marple's long experience, were about to make their final, fatal mistake. The morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage with the determined expression of a man who had spent the night arranging pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. He carried with him not only the accumulated evidence of their investigation, but also a growing certainty that conventional police methods would prove insufficient for exposing a killer who had planned their crime with meticulous psychological precision. "I believe the time has come for a more direct approach," Miss Marple suggested gently, setting aside her knitting with the deliberate care of someone preparing for significant action. "Perhaps a small gathering this afternoon at the vicarage would allow us to observe how our various suspects respond when presented with the complete pattern of evidence." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose with interest. "A trap, Miss Marple?" "Rather a test of character, Inspector. In my experience, the guilty party invariably reveals themselves when confronted with the full scope of their deception, particularly when they believe they have successfully concealed their tracks." By 3 o'clock, the vicarage drawing room had been transformed into an intimate theater for what Miss Marple privately considered the final act of their investigation. Sarah Mitchell had arranged the tea service with her characteristic efficiency, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she positioned the cups. Mrs. Tarrant occupied the settee with rigid dignity, the empty sewing box beside her like a monument to lost secrets. Dr. Pierce stood near the mantelpiece with the studied casualness of a man attempting to appear unconcerned, while Mr. Avery had positioned himself strategically where he could observe everyone's reactions. "Such a relief to have this dreadful business nearly concluded," Mrs. Tarrant observed, her voice carrying forced brightness. "Poor Dorothy would have wanted us to return to normal village life as quickly as possible." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm. "Indeed, though I suspect Mrs. Hartwell would have preferred that certain truth be acknowledged before we attempt to restore normalcy. She was, after all, quite determined to put something right before the bazaar." Sarah Mitchell's tea service paused almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Hartwell was always concerned with proper procedures. Perhaps she simply wanted to ensure the raffle was conducted fairly. "Oh, I think her concerns extended far beyond raffle procedures," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Her correspondence with Calthorpe and Mellish suggests she had uncovered something rather more significant than irregular bazaar management, something involving the true ownership of that beautiful sewing box, and more importantly, the circumstances surrounding its acquisition in 1923. The silence that followed carried weight beyond mere politeness. Dr. Pierce shifted position slightly, his medical bag catching the afternoon light where it rested beside his chair. Mrs. Tarrant's fingers worried at the fabric of her skirt, while Mr. Avery leaned forward with barely concealed anticipation. The year 1923 seems particularly significant to our investigation, Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its conversational tone while her eyes moved systematically from face to face. Dr. Pierce's father's medical records reference a young woman requiring discretion, a child requiring placement, and valuable items provided as security for ongoing care. The initials MT appear repeatedly in these records, along with specific mention of a mahogany sewing box with mother-of-pearl inlay. Mrs. Tarrant's composure cracked slightly. My Aunt Millicent faced difficult circumstances that year. The Whitmore estate was being broken up, and many valuable items were redistributed among family members. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect the redistribution was rather more complex than simple family inheritance. Mrs. Hartwell's investigation revealed that items from the Whitmore estate were used to secure the placement and ongoing care of Millicent Tarrant's illegitimate child. A child who was quietly adopted by a respectable local family and raised without knowledge of their true parentage. Sarah Mitchell's cup rattled against its saucer with sudden violence. The sound seemed to echo in the charged atmosphere of the drawing room, and Miss Marple observed how the young woman's face had gone perfectly white. The christening gown pattern that Dulcie Reed's grandmother created tells the complete story, Miss Marple continued relentlessly. Marked July 1923, and commissioned for a child who would never publicly acknowledge their birth mother. Mrs. Hartwell had traced every connection, the medical records, the pattern book, the resemblance in old photographs, even the inquiries she made to the Foundling Hospital. Inspector Slack stepped forward with professional gravity. Miss Mitchell, I believe Miss Marple is suggesting that you are the child referenced in these records. That you are, in fact, the illegitimate daughter of Millicent Tarrant. Sarah Mitchell rose abruptly from her chair, her composed facade finally shattering like delicate porcelain struck by an iron hammer. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice breaking with 30 years of carefully suppressed emotion. None of you understand what it means to discover that your entire life has been built on lies and stolen property. Miss Marple's voice carried infinite gentleness. Mrs. Hartwell told you what she had discovered, didn't she? She meant to help you understand your true heritage, but instead she threatened to destroy the only identity you had ever known. She was going to announce everything at the bazaar. Sarah's confession poured forth with the desperate relief of a dam finally bursting. She had prepared a complete statement proving my parentage, exposing the theft from the Whitmore estate, revealing that my adoptive family had built their reputation on deception. She thought I would be grateful for the truth. Dr. Pierce moved toward his medical bag with obvious concern. Sarah, you don't need to continue. Let me help you. Help me. Sarah's laugh held no humor whatsoever. The way you helped by leaving your medical supplies where I could access them? The way you helped by never questioning why I knew so much about cardiac medications from assisting with your patients? The final pieces of Miss Marple's careful deduction fell into place with terrible clarity. Sarah Mitchell had used her position assisting Dr. Pierce to obtain the means for undetectable murder, then systematically eliminated every piece of evidence that might expose her crime. The duplicate key, the emptied sewing box, the stolen pattern book, all represented desperate attempts to erase a past that had already claimed one innocent life. Inspector Slack moved forward with professional efficiency, but Miss Marple reflected sadly that the real tragedy lay not in the murder itself, but in the desperate lengths to which people would go to protect secrets that, once revealed, proved far less devastating than the crimes committed to conceal them. Sarah Mitchell had destroyed both Mrs. Hartwell's life and her own in a futile attempt to preserve an identity that was never truly hers to keep. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the vicarage drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with thoughtful precision, reflecting once again on the dangerous depths that lay beneath the placid surface of village life, and the terrible price that people paid for secrets that should never have been kept at all. Sarah Mitchell's confession hung in the afternoon air like incense, heavy with the weight of 30 years of carefully guarded secrets. Inspector Slack positioned himself with professional caution, though the young woman showed no inclination toward flight. Instead, she seemed to collapse inward, her composed facade finally cracking like delicate porcelain under unbearable pressure. "I never intended for it to happen," she whispered, her voice carrying the hollow quality of absolute defeat. "Mrs. Hartwell came to me 3 days before the bazaar, so excited about her discoveries. She had traced everything, the medical records, the pattern book, even correspondence she'd found between my adoptive parents and those London solicitors. She thought I would be grateful to finally know the truth about my birth." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with gentle rhythm, their soft clicking providing a counterpoint to Sarah's increasingly desperate words. The afternoon light slanting through the vicarage windows seemed to grow dimmer as the full scope of the tragedy began to unfold. "She was going to announce it all at the bazaar," Sarah continued, her composure fragmenting entirely. "She had prepared a complete statement proving that I was Millicent Tarrant's illegitimate daughter, that the sewing box rightfully belonged to the Whitmore estate, that my entire life had been built on lies and stolen property. She thought the truth would set me free." Dr. Pierce stepped forward with obvious distress, his medical bag forgotten beside his chair. "Sarah, surely Mrs. Hartwell could have been persuaded to handle the matter more discreetly. Could she?" Sarah's laugh carried bitter irony. "You didn't know Dorothy Hartwell as I did. Once she decided something was right and proper, nothing could deter her from her course. She was absolutely determined that justice should be served, regardless of the consequences to anyone else." Mrs. Tarrant, who had remained silent throughout the confession, finally spoke with trembling voice. "But surely your adoptive parents would have understood. My adoptive parents built their entire social position on being the respectable family who had rescued an orphaned child from unfortunate circumstances," Sarah interrupted. "They never knew the truth about the stolen items or my illegitimate birth. Mrs. Hartwell's revelations would have exposed them as unwitting accomplices to theft, destroyed their reputation in the community, and revealed me as the bastard daughter of a woman who had fled the county in disgrace." Miss Marple observed the interplay of emotions across Sarah's face with the same careful attention she gave to complex knitting patterns. "So you arranged to meet her in the vestry during the bazaar. She insisted on retrieving the documents from the sewing box herself, using that duplicate key she had commissioned from Tom Fletcher. She was so proud of her detective work, so certain that everyone would appreciate her efforts to put things right. I told her I wanted to discuss the matter privately before any public announcement." The young woman's hands twisted in her lap as she approached the crucial moment of her narrative. "I brought tea from the refreshment tent. Mrs. Hartwell was so focused on opening the sewing box and examining those hidden documents that she barely noticed when I added the cardiac medication to her cup. Your medical supplies were always accessible when I assisted with your rounds, Dr. Pierce, and I'd learned enough about proper dosages during our visits to elderly patients." Dr. Pierce's face had gone ashen. "The digitalis from my emergency kit. I noticed the vial was nearly empty, but assumed I had simply used more than usual during recent house calls." "It was so terribly simple," Sarah whispered. She drank the tea while reading through the documents, growing more excited with each revelation. When the medication began to take effect, she became confused, disoriented. I helped her to the chair, told her to rest while I fetched help. By the time I returned with Mrs. Pemberton, claiming to have just discovered her, it was far too late. Inspector Slack's notebook moved steadily across the page, recording each detail with professional thoroughness. "And the documents from the sewing box?" "I removed them while pretending to check her pulse for signs of life. The hidden compartment was exactly as Mrs. Hartwell had described. The papers proved everything she had claimed. Birth certificates, correspondence with the adoption agency, even receipts for items taken from the Whitmore estate as security for my care. I destroyed them all that same evening." Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the charged atmosphere with characteristic precision. "But you couldn't destroy Mrs. Hartwell's own notes and correspondence, could you, my dear? Hence the burglary at Dulcie Reed's shop, the returned pattern book with the crucial christening gown tracing removed, the steel ruler Tom Fletcher discovered in the hedge. Every piece of evidence had to be eliminated," Sarah confirmed. "The pattern book, the medical records Dr. Pierce's father had kept, even the advertisement Mrs. Hartwell had placed seeking information about the Whitmore estate dispersal. I thought I had been thorough enough to cover every connection." "You were certainly methodical," Miss Marple agreed, her tone carrying infinite sadness rather than condemnation. "Though perhaps too methodical. The very completeness of the evidence destruction suggested deliberate planning rather than coincidental loss. And the chalk dust from Dulcie's grandmother's sewing supplies, the coal tar soap scent on the returned package, the distinctive boot prints beneath my window, all these small details painted a picture of someone growing increasingly desperate to eliminate traces of their crime. Mr. Avery, who had remained silent throughout the confession, finally spoke with obvious bewilderment. "But why not simply allow the truth to emerge? Illegitimate birth carries far less stigma now than it did 30 years ago." Sarah's response carried the weight of a lifetime's carefully constructed identity. "You don't understand what it means to discover that everything you believed about yourself was false. My parents, my name, my place in this community, all of it built on deception and theft. Mrs. Hartwell's revelations would have destroyed not just my reputation, but my entire sense of who I am." The silence that followed seemed to encompass not just the immediate tragedy, but the broader questions of identity, truth, and the terrible prices people paid for secrets that perhaps should never have been kept at all. Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony that Sarah Mitchell had committed murder to preserve a false identity, only to lose both her assumed self and her actual freedom in the process. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with professional finality. "Miss Mitchell, I must caution you that anything further you say may be used in evidence against you. I'm afraid you'll need to accompany me to the station." As he began the formal procedures, Miss Marple continued her knitting with thoughtful precision, reflecting once again on the dangerous currents that flowed beneath the placid surface of village life. The mahogany sewing box sat empty on the settee beside Mrs. Tarrant, its hidden compartment exposed like a wound that could never properly heal. The truth, as Mrs. Hartwell had so earnestly believed, had indeed emerged, but at a cost far greater than anyone could have imagined. In her desperate attempt to preserve lies, Sarah Mitchell had created a tragedy that would haunt St. Mary Mead long after the immediate scandal had faded into village memory. Outside the vicarage windows, the afternoon shadows grew longer, and the distant sounds of normal village life continued. Children playing, a dog barking, the gentle clatter of tea things being cleared away. But within the drawing room, the weight of revelation hung heavy as the participants grappled with the realization that sometimes the most dangerous secrets were those we kept from ourselves. The quiet efficiency with which Inspector Slack completed the formal procedures seemed almost anticlimactic after the devastating revelations of the afternoon. Sarah Mitchell offered no resistance as she was led away. Her composed facade finally cracked beyond repair, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a woman who had sacrificed everything to preserve an identity that was never truly hers to keep. The vicarage drawing room settled into that peculiar stillness that follows the resolution of long-held mysteries. Mrs. Tarrant remained on the settee beside the empty sewing box, her fingers worrying at the fabric of her skirt as she processed the full implications of what had been revealed. Dr. Pierce stood frozen by the mantelpiece, his medical bag a silent reproach to the trust that had been so fatally misused. "To think she was among us all these years," Mrs. Tarrant whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of unknowing proximity to such desperate deception. "So helpful, so reliable. How could we not have seen?" Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, providing a comforting counterpoint to the charged atmosphere. We see what people choose to show us, my dear. Sarah Mitchell had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of appearing exactly as she wished to be perceived. Her very competence became her camouflage. Mr. Avery, who had remained strategically silent throughout much of the confession, finally cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. The matter of the sewing box itself remains unresolved, with the original documents destroyed and questions of legal ownership. Will be handled by the proper authorities, Inspector Slack interrupted firmly, though I suspect the London solicitors are more concerned with historical justice than monetary compensation. The box itself was never the true issue. It was the secrets it contained that proved so dangerous. Dr. Pierce finally spoke, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. I keep thinking that if I had been more careful with my medical supplies, more observant about the missing digitalis— You mustn't torment yourself, Miss Marple said gently. Sarah Mitchell possessed both the knowledge and opportunity to commit this crime precisely because of her genuine desire to help others. Her corruption of that trust was her choice alone, not a failure of your medical practice. As the official matters concluded and the participants began to disperse, Miss Marple remained behind to help restore order to the disrupted drawing room. The simple act of clearing teacups and straightening cushions provided a necessary return to normalcy after the afternoon's revelations. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead absorbed the shock with the resilience that characterized English villages throughout history. The news spread with inevitable swiftness, creating ripples of gossip and speculation that gradually settled into acceptance. The annual bazaar was quietly rescheduled for the following month, though the mahogany sewing box would no longer serve as the grand prize. Mrs. Tarrant had donated it to the church with the stipulation that it be used for storing altar linens, a practical purpose that seemed to diminish its capacity for harboring dangerous secrets. Dulcie Reed reopened her shop with subdued determination, her grandmother's pattern book now displayed in a place of honor behind glass. The christening gown design that had played such a crucial role in the investigation was carefully preserved, a testament to honest craftsmanship unmarred by the deceptions it had unwittingly helped expose. Tom Fletcher completed his repairs around the village with characteristic thoroughness, though Miss Marple noticed he now declined requests involving locks or keys, referring such work to the proper locksmith in Much Benham. Dr. Pierce installed additional security measures for his medical supplies and began requiring written requests for any assistance with his rounds. Mrs. Blackwood maintained the post office with militant efficiency, though she was observed to handle registered letters with particular care, as if mindful of the power such correspondence could wield over carefully constructed lives. Miss Marple walked slowly through the familiar lanes each evening, observing the gradual return to routine while reflecting on the case's broader implications. The surface tranquility of village life had reasserted itself, but she understood that beneath that placid exterior, the currents of human nature continued to flow with all their complexity and potential for both creation and destruction. The tragedy of Sarah Mitchell served as yet another reminder that the most dangerous secrets were often those we kept from ourselves. In her desperate attempt to preserve a false identity, she had destroyed not only Mrs. Hartwell's life, but her own carefully constructed existence. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple that Sarah's very efforts to prevent exposure had ultimately guaranteed it. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple completed the pale blue cardigan that had occupied her attention throughout the investigation. Each stitch represented a small act of creation, a gentle counterpoint to the destruction that fear and desperation had wrought in their peaceful community. The brass key that had initiated her investigation now rested in official custody, but Miss Marple understood that the real key to the mystery had been far more elusive. The key to understanding how ordinary people could be driven to extraordinary acts when their fundamental sense of self was threatened. On quiet evenings, she would sit by her window watching the familiar rhythms of village life continue. Children playing in gardens, neighbors exchanging pleasantries over garden gates, the comfortable patterns of community existence reasserting themselves despite the recent upheaval. Yet she knew that every community held countless secrets, waiting in the shadows of ordinary life for that inevitable moment when truth and deception would collide once again. The secret kept in the sewing box had finally been revealed, but Miss Marple understood that human nature remained the greatest mystery of all, capable of both tremendous love and terrible fear, often existing side by side in the same heart. St. Mary Mead had returned to its peaceful surface, forever changed by the recognition that beneath even the most tranquil communities lay depths that could never be fully fathomed. Outside her cottage window, the church bell marked the evening hour with its steady, forgiving chime, and Miss Marple smiled softly, knowing that tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new secrets, and new opportunities to observe the endlessly fascinating complexity of the human heart.